So once again, we're on page 395, Parsha Yisro. It begins, Yisro, the minister of Midian, the father-in-law of Moshe, heard everything that Hashem did to Moshe and to Israel, his people, that Hashem had taken Israel out of Egypt. So he heard everything that happened, and Yisro, the father-in-law of Moshe, took Zipporah, the wife of Moshe, after she had been sent away, and her two sons, of whom the name of one was Gershom, for he had said, I am a sojourner in a strange land, and the name of the other was Eliezer, for the God of my father came to my aid, and he saved me from the sword of Parah. So there's a few things that are interesting about this, this paragraph. Primarily what I want to talk about is that it says that he took Yisro, the father-in-law of Moshe, took Zipporah, the wife of Moshe, after she had been sent away. What is that coming, like, where does that come from, after he had been sent away? So who is it? So I think it's the Ramban answers that it's coming to answer a question that you may have, and that is that when Moshe was charged by Hashem to leave Midian and go to Egypt and to to take the Jews out of Egypt. So there it said that Moshe took his wife and his sons and left, and he left the land of Midian to go to Egypt. And that's really the last mention we have of his wife and sons. It also says that while he was on the way, there was a snake that was eating his son, and his wife Zipporah grabbed a stone and circumcised his son. And so we see that they were there, they were with him. So why all of a sudden is Yisro bringing his wife and kids from Midian? And that's what is answering that he's bringing them because after they had been sent away, Moshe had sent them away, because when Moshe arrived in Egypt, he was arriving in Egypt, his brother Aaron went out to greet him, and Aaron asked him, what are you doing bringing your wife and kids here? There's enough Jews are suffering in Egypt, we don't need you to bring more. And because of that, he took that advice and sent them away, and now they're coming back, and that's what it's answering. Okay, it continues in verse 5. Yisro, the father-in-law of Moshe, came to Moshe with his sons, his wife, and wife to the wilderness where he was encamped by the mountain of God. He said to Moshe, I, your father-in-law Yisro, have come to you with your wife and her two sons with her. So he sent this message to Moshe. And in verse 7, Moshe went out to meet his father-in-law, and he prostrated himself and kissed him, and each inquired about the other's well-being. Then they came to the tent. Moshe told his father-in-law everything that Hashem had done to Pharaoh in Egypt for Israel's sake, all of the travail that had befallen them on the way, and that Hashem had rescued them. Now there's a dispute amongst the commentaries when exactly this took place. This story of Yisro returning to the Jewish people, when it took place. And many of the commentaries, I believe Rashi says that this happened actually after the giving of the Torah. And it's out of order, and he gives some proofs to that. But the Ramban maintains very strongly that unless the Torah says, unless our sages say otherwise, and unless there's any indication otherwise, we assume that events in the Torah are in chronological order. He agrees they are not always in chronological order, but there's no indication that it isn't. And he brings as a support to that, as it says right here in verse, where is it? In verse 8, where it says that Moshe told his father-in-law everything that Hashem had done to Pharaoh in Egypt for Israel's sake, all the travail that had befallen them on the way, and that Hashem had rescued them, it says nothing about Moshe telling him about the giving of the Torah. So that seems to indicate that this happened before the giving of the Torah. But okay, anyway, it continues in verse 9. Yisro rejoiced over all the good that Hashem had done for Israel, and that he had rescued it from Egypt. Yisro said, blessed is Hashem who has rescued you from the hand of Egypt and from the hand of Pharaoh, who had rescued the people from under the hand of Egypt. Now that I know that Hashem is the greatest of all the gods, for in the very manner in which the Egyptians had conspired against them, they were punished. Meaning they were punished in the same way they conspired against the Jews. And the Ramban explains that that he understood that the main sin of the Egyptians, the primary sin that they were punished for, is that they threw the Jewish baby boys into the Nile River. And the reason why that was the primary sin, even though they enslaved us for a long time, made us work very hard. But that was already pre-planned in a sense, that Hashem had told Abraham already years before, hundreds of years before. Hashem had told Abraham that the Jews were going to be, that his descendants were to be slaves in a land that was not theirs, and they would be oppressed. Then they would be oppressed there. So the Egyptians were really fulfilling a prophecy that was already told to Abraham. So while the Rabbi Slater spoke about this a few weeks ago in his drasha, that while this may have been a, depending on which commentary you go with, maybe they deserve punishment for that because they weren't the ones who were picked. It wasn't specific that the Egyptians were to be the ones to fulfill that prophecy, but it seems that they were that at least it was a fulfillment of a prophecy, so they weren't so deserving of punishment for it. The problem really was that they took it too far, and they took it too far by throwing the Jewish boys into the Nile River. Every Jewish boy who was born was to be killed. That was not promised in that prophecy to Abraham, and that's really what they were punished for. And therefore, they were punished by being drowned in the sea, as that was their primary punishment. That Paro and all the warriors of Egypt were drowned in the sea as a punishment, and that's what Yisro saw, that in the same manner that they had sinned, they were punished. Another thing the commentaries mention is that, as it states in verse 9, it says, Yisro rejoiced all the good that Hashem had done for Israel, that he had rescued it from Egypt. It doesn't say he had rescued them from Egypt. It uses the singular. Our scroll translates it as it, but it could also be translated as him. That he rejoiced that Hashem had rescued him from Egypt. And Reb Shimon Schwab explains that singular was because the Medrash says that Yisro was an advisor to Paro. And Paro had three advisors. He had Bilam was one of his advisors, and Job was one of his advisors, and Yisro was his advisor. And he asked them, what should I do about the Jews? And Bilam said, enslave them. Job kept quiet, and Yisro said, don't do anything to them, and he ran away. And he realized that because he ran away, that's why he was still alive. That's why he was saved. Because if he would not have given that advice and he would not have fled from Egypt, he would have remained Paro's advisor. He would have remained in Egypt, and he would have been subject to all the plagues that the Egyptians went through, and culminating in the death of the firstborn and all the warriors being drowning at the Red Sea. So he rejoiced over that Hashem had rescued him from Egypt by causing him to flee. Okay, it continues in verse 13. It was the next day that Moshe sat to judge the people, and the people stood by Moshe from the morning until the evening. The father-in-law of Moshe saw everything that he was doing to the people, and he said, what is this thing that you do to the people? Why do you sit alone with all the people standing by you from morning until evening? So he saw that Moshe was sitting there, and all the people who wanted to consult with Moshe waited around all day to talk to him. And in verse 15 on page 399, it says, Moshe said to his father-in-law, he answered him, because the people come to me to seek God. When they have a matter, one comes to me, and I judge between a man and his fellow, and I make known the decrees of God and his teachings. And the Ramban explains Moshe's answer is that he was saying that they're here all day because I wear a lot of hats. I'm not just wearing one hat. I'm not just a judge judging disputes. First of all, it says that the people come to me to seek God. And the Ramban understands that to mean that people would come to him to ask him to daven for them, to pray for them. And he was kind of like a Rebbe in a sense, that many times people go to Hasidic Rebbes to pray for them, that they want like a holy person to pray for them, someone who's closer to God. So they would go to Moshe to pray for them. And like it says, when there's a matter, one comes to me and I judge between man and his fellow, that I resolve disputes. And it concludes, and I make known the decrees of God and his teachings, and I teach Torah. So when anyone has a question in the Torah, they also come to me. So he's saying, I'm very busy because I'm doing all these three jobs. So people are waiting around all day to see me. And Yisro's, the father-in-law of Moshe, said to him that you should delegate. He gave him advice that instead of you being the only one to do this, you should delegate and select people to do it for you, and really have a court system with a hierarchy. that there is the courts for a few people, and then there's the higher courts, and if they can't resolve it, it goes to higher court, and it keeps on getting bumped up until it goes to you, Moshe. And in verse 23, after that, it states, if you do this thing and God shall command you, then you'll be able to endure, and this entire people as well shall arrive at its destination in peace. That if you do this, the people will have peace. So the Ramban explains that what's this idea of if you do this, they'll have peace? Did they not have peace before? Was Moshe not a good enough judge? Or was there pushing in line? What's this idea that if you do this, they'll have peace as opposed to now? So the Ramban explains that in order for justice to work, it has to be available. Because if people are going to have to wait around all day, they'd have to sit in line from morning until evening to have their case heard. If it's difficult to have their case heard, people will skip it. People will have to calculate, is it worth my time? Is it worth the effort? Is it worth all the trouble to go through this case? Or maybe I'll just have to forget about it because it's not worth it. And when that happens, there isn't peace because the disputes are left unresolved. And so what Yisro was saying is that you have to, that by delegating, that means that there'll be more minor judges who are more available to the people because they don't have as many people who are trying to get to them. And thereby, if there'll be somebody to resolve their disputes, and they'll be able to, that'll be available to them without a big kirk, without all the trouble. And that's really what brings peace. And just to be clear, this does not mean that that taking everything to court and having a judge resolve it is necessarily the solution to have peace. In fact, my Rosh Yeshiva spoke many times over, I've heard many times from him that sometimes the laws of the Torah, especially when it comes to the laws of the Torah of monetary law, that's not necessarily the first resort. Meaning the Torah has laws and they're just laws, but justice is not always our goal, or justice is our goal. But the goal isn't always that the Torah says that you're entitled to that, so you have to make sure you get it because you're entitled to it. Ultimately, the best way for finding peace, and maybe the best way of justice, is compromise. And many times that a judge's role might be to help people compromise rather than saying the Torah says that this person is entitled to the money in this case for the following reasons, therefore he gets everything. Because even though that's truth, that based on the circumstances and based on what's known to the judge, that's what the halacha follows, but that doesn't always bring to peace because the judge could only decide based upon what he knows, first of all, and what he knows could be limited because obviously you have one person claiming one thing, one person claiming the other thing, and the truth probably lies somewhere in the middle, or maybe the truth lies completely with one person, but you have no way of knowing because there's no proof. So ultimately, the ideal is that we find some middle ground, that when there's a dispute, we're able to connect the two people and talk about it, that, you're claiming this, you're claiming this. The truth might be with both of you, that you might both be right, that there's something that happened. And according to Torah law, he might be entitled, but let's see if we could compromise. Let's see if he pays half. That way, everybody comes away with something, and you don't have to go through the court system. So compromise sometimes is, sometimes justice in the sense of a court case being available is not always the best thing. But when it's necessary for it not to be available, that just leaves tension simmering and leaves disputes and ultimately leads to lack of peace. Okay, so on page 401, it states that Moshe heeded the voice of his father-in-law and did everything that he had said. Moshe chose men of accomplishment from among all Israel and appointed them heads of the people, leaders of thousands, that means a judge for every 1,000 people, leaders of hundreds, a judge for every 100 people, leaders of 50s, leaders of 10s. They judged the people at all times. The difficult things they would bring to Moshe and the minor things they themselves would judge. And Moshe sent off his father-in-law and he went to his land. And this happened later, according to the Ramban, that Yisro came to join the Jewish people and then he left. And he left in order to spread the Torah to his family. And then he came back, as we see in the books of the prophets, that there's mention of Yisro's family in the land of Israel throughout really the books of the prophets. Where is it? Okay, another thing I wanted to, well, I'll skip that. We're running a little late. So on page 401, chapter 19, it states in the third month, from the exodus of the children of Israel from Egypt, on this day they arrived at the wilderness of Sinai. And it states they journeyed from Rephidim and arrived at the wilderness of Sinai and encamped in the wilderness, and Israel encamped there opposite the mountain. And the Hebrew here in verse 2, the Hebrew for they encamped there, Israel encamped there opposite the mountain, everything here is plural. They journeyed and encamped in the wilderness, but the verb for encamped is singular. It's vayichan, the singular form for they encamped, instead of vayachanu, which would be the plural form for they encamped. And the Medrash says that this is to tell us that they were, when they arrived at Sinai to receive the Torah, they were like one person with one heart, like one person with one heart. And the commentaries explain that that was a prerequisite for receiving the Torah. We had to be united to receive the Torah because the Torah couldn't be given in any other manner. And so the commentaries say that one of the reasons for this is that the Torah was not given to individuals. There's no individual who could claim that the Torah was given to me or the Torah was given to my group, and we're the ones entitled to learn the Torah and interpret the Torah. The Torah was given to the Jewish people as a whole. Everybody has their portion in the Torah. Everybody has has what to contribute towards the understanding of the Torah. And even someone who's not a great Torah scholar, they have our sages say that there's a portion in the Torah for every person. That means that they have what to contribute that even the greatest scholar would not be able to understand without this person, because every person has their own perspective. Everybody lived their life in a different way, and everybody is looking at the Torah based on all their experiences and based on how they live, how they've lived, and everybody has a different blend of talents also. So somebody who's spent their entire life learning will not have the same insight, will have perhaps greater insight from having studied more Torah, but will have a different insight than somebody who's coming from somewhere else, from a different place with different talents. And therefore the Torah was given to everybody. It was given to the Jewish people when we were all united as one group. Additionally, the Beis Yitzchak says that the Torah, it was given to us when we were united because the Torah is really the ideal way, and in some ways the only way to learn the Torah is in a group. That one cannot learn the Torah when they're alone. And we could study, but it's not the ideal way of understanding the Torah, because when we study when we're alone, even the greatest scholar, you can miss something. And you think you understand, but sometimes our minds fool us. And this happens to the best of us, is that we just make mistakes. And when you don't have someone looking over your shoulder, somebody listening to you and to point things out, you miss things. And that's why the standard for studying in yeshivas is a chavrusa, it's a study partner, that you almost never find in a yeshiva that somebody will be studying alone. It's always with another person, because we don't know if what we're saying makes any sense. It could make sense to us, but it might objectively not make sense unless we have somebody else listening who could point that out. But the chavrusa system, or the chabura system, which means learning in a group, also could only work when there's shalom, when there's peace between other people. Because when there's tension, and when there's lack of peace, so then people get defensive, and they just want to defend their own position. It stops being about the pursuit of truth and becomes a defending, this is what I believe, and that has to be true. And when there's hatred between others, when there's division, so people get more tied down to what they believe and are not willing to think about it and to have it challenged and to listen to the challenges, and think that perhaps maybe the person across from me might have a point. But when there's lack of peace with that person, so then people get defensive, and people start coming, everybody has their own set of facts, and they're not willing to listen to each other to judge and to analyze if what they believe is actually true. Okay, so it continues that in verse 3, Moshe ascended to God, and Hashem called him from the mountain, saying, so shall you say to the house of Jacob, and relate to the children of Israel. And in chapter 19, verse 4, bottom of page 401, you have seen what I did to Egypt, and that I have borne you on the wings of eagles and brought you to me. And now if you hearken well to me and observe my covenant, you shall be to me the most beloved treasure of all people, for mine is the entire world. You shall be to me a kingdom of ministers and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the children of Israel, that by accepting the Torah will be a kingdom of ministers and a holy nation. That means every single one of us is holy through accepting the Torah. And that's what Moshe did. And he told them what Hashem told him. And in verse 8 and on page 403, the entire people responded together and said, everything that Hashem has spoken, we shall do. Moshe brought back the words of the people to Hashem. Interestingly, if you look here, it says, all that Hashem has spoken, we shall do. There's a famous pronouncement, Nasa v'nishma, we shall do, whatever Hashem said, we shall do, and we shall listen. That's not said here, it just says we shall do. Whereas in Mishpatim, next week's Parsha, this is in Shemos 24:7, chapter 24, verse 7. And there. So this is on page 441, chapter 24, verse 7. So it states, he took the book of the covenant and read it in earshot of the people, and they said, everything that Hashem has said, we will do and we will obey. So here it says, we will do and we will obey. Literally, we will do and we will listen. And that's in next week's Parsha. In this week's Parsha, it says, everything that Hashem has spoken, we shall do it. Not says we will do and we will listen. And the Meshech Chochmah explains that it's impossible for a single person to perform all of the mitzvahs in the Torah, because all the mitzvahs in the Torah are not doable. You don't have every mitzvah in the Torah given to any one individual. For example, there are some mitzvahs that are specific to Kohanim, and those are primarily the mitzvahs that are related to the bringing the offerings are primarily performed by Kohanim, and in fact, a non-Kohen cannot do it. And there are some mitzvahs that are specific to Leviim, to Levites. There are some mitzvahs that are specific to Yisraelim, to Israelites. There are some mitzvahs that are specific to men, and there are some mitzvahs that are specific to women. So no one person could do all the mitzvahs. So how could the people say everything that Hashem commanded us we will do? So the Meshech Chochmah says there are two ways to do that. One way is as a group. An individual can't keep the whole Torah, but the group could keep the whole Torah. And because at this point in this week's Parsha, we said that they were like one person with one heart, that the Jewish people were completely united. So they were able to say, we will do everything that Hashem said, because as a group, they were united as one, and as one, as a group, they were able to say, we will keep the Torah. Whereas in next week's Parsha Mishpatim, so at that point, they were not as united anymore. They had lost that complete unity, that perfect unity. And because of that, they couldn't say, we will do all the mitzvahs, because one individual cannot do all the mitzvahs. So therefore they said, we will do and we will hear, meaning we will do and we will study. And that's the other way to do the mitzvahs, that there's the mitzvahs that we cannot do. The Talmud says that if we study about the mitzvah, so it's considered as if we have performed it. So they said, we will, everything that Hashem has commanded us, we will do and we will listen. We'll do the ones that we could perform actively, and we'll study the ones that we can't perform actively, and thereby we're doing all of them. And just as an aside, that's the reason why, if you look in the Siddur, it in Shachris, before the first Kaddish in the Siddur, the part that we kind of skip in Shul, but it has the order of the korbanos, the order of the offerings that were brought in the temple every morning. And the reason for that is that we can't perform those mitzvahs now because we don't have the temple. But when we study about it, it's considered as if we perform them. So some have the custom to read them at that point, and that's the study of the order of the offerings, and thereby be considered as if they have brought the offerings themselves. Okay, so now continuing on, it states that in verse 10, it states, Hashem said to Moshe, go to the people and sanctify them today and tomorrow, and they shall wash their clothing. Let them be prepared for the third day. On the third day, Hashem shall descend in the sight of the entire people on Mount Sinai. And in verse 12, on page 405, you shall set boundaries for the people round about, saying, beware of ascending the mountain, because anyone who touches it shall die. And in the end of verse 13, it says, upon an extended blast of the shofar, they may ascend the mountain. And there's a little bit of an emphasis on that, is that we're not allowed to go on the mountain. Anyone who touches it will die. On the blast of a shofar, you could ascend the mountain. And a lot of the commentaries say this is a key statement about the nature of holiness in Judaism, is that the Mount Sinai is, we can't even imagine the holiness of Mount Sinai. This is the place that God's presence came down, and God gave us the Torah. God gave us the 10 Commandments, spoke to us, I know personally is the wrong word, but spoke to us directly to give us the 10 Commandments. And Moshe ascended there and was taught the Torah by Hashem. Yet, once it's done, we're allowed to ascend the mountain. There's no holiness to the mountain once Hashem's presence is gone. Whereas the place of the temple, after the temple was built, that place is holy because God's presence rests there. And this tells us something about holiness, is that a place isn't holy. Because if a place was holy, this would be the holiest place in the world. Yet once the shofar sounds, once Hashem's presence is gone, you could run up and down the mountain as much as you want. What makes something holy is that Hashem's presence is there, not because something happened there, not because there's any intrinsic holiness to it. It's just the only thing holy is Hashem and what Hashem chooses to be holy. Okay, so moving on. And on verse 16, page 405, on the third day when it was morning, there was thunder, lightning, a heavy cloud on the mountain. The sound of the shofar was very powerful, and the entire people that was in the camp shuddered. Moshe brought the people forth from the camp towards Hashem, and they stood at the bottom of the mountain. All of Mount Sinai was smoking because Hashem had descended upon it in the fire. The smoke ascended like the smoke of the furnace, and the entire mountain shuddered exceedingly. The sound of the shofar grew continually much stronger. Moshe would speak, and God would respond to him with a voice. And then it says in verse 21, Hashem said to Moshe, descend, warn the people, lest they break through to Hashem to see, and a multitude of them will fall. Again, he told him to tell the people to stay away, which he told them already earlier to tell the people not to touch the mountain and erect a boundary. And the commentaries say that we're told again, and this teaches us about the nature of people, that if you want people to listen to you, you have to tell them, you have to warn them twice. If you want people to listen when you warn them not to do something, you should tell them in advance and tell them at the time. Because if you just tell somebody in advance not to do something, so they'll forget in the moment and do it. But if you just tell them in the moment, they'll also forget. They'll be inspired and forget that you need to tell them twice. You need to tell them in advance so they have it in their mind, and you need to tell them in the moment as a reminder, and that's how you really prevent someone from doing something. Okay? And now in verse 1, chapter 20, verse 1 on page 407, we have the 10 Commandments. And it begins, Hashem spoke all these statements saying, I am Hashem your God who has taken you out of the land of Egypt from the house of slavery. You shall not recognize the gods of others in my presence. You shall not make yourself a carved image, nor any likeness of that which is in the heavens above, or on the earth below, or in the water beneath the earth. Verse 5, you shall not prostrate yourself to them, nor worship them. For I am Hashem, your God, a jealous God who visits the sin of the fathers upon children to the third and fourth generations for my enemies, but who shows kindness for thousands of generations to those who love me and observe my commandments. Okay, so this is very dense. There's a lot here. So I'll start with the beginning, that it's verse 2, it says, I am Hashem, your God, who has taken you out of the land of Egypt from the house of slavery. This is the first of the 10 Commandments. This verse, I am Hashem, your God, who has taken you out of the land of Egypt from the house of slavery. The commandment is to believe in God. And one thing that the commentaries comment on is that it states that I am Hashem who took you out of the land of Egypt. It does not say, I am Hashem, your God, who created the world. So what's the reason for that? So the Ramban says that, first of all, this is telling us this is the basis of our belief in God. This verse right here. This is the basis of our belief, is that I am Hashem who took you out of Egypt. You have to believe in me. So Hashem's telling us something that we witnessed. We witnessed Hashem taking us out of Egypt. So that gives us an obligation, gives us a tradition, I should say, from father to son, and that's what the Seder is about, is that we, throughout all the generations, we have discussed about how Hashem took us out of Egypt without any interruption, and that gives us the proof to believe that Hashem exists, because we know Hashem took us out of Egypt, because that's what our father told us, his father told us, his father told us, etc., who experienced it. So Hashem's telling us what we have seen. I am Hashem who took you out of Egypt. Additionally, the commentaries say that and the song in last week's Parsha, when after we were rescued at the sea, Hashem split the sea. So in the song of the sea that we say every day during davening, so it says, God, Hashem ish melchama, God is a man of war. That God was revealed to them as a warrior. And the Medrash says that at Mount Sinai, they saw Hashem, whatever that, they didn't see an image, as it says. They didn't see any kind of image, but Hashem was revealed to them as an old man, an old merciful man. That's the impression they had of Hashem at Mount Sinai. So Hashem's saying, I am Hashem, your God, who took you out of Egypt, meaning I am the same entity that took you out of Egypt. There aren't two entities, one that's this man of war, destructive force destroying Egypt, and one that's giving you these commandments, this merciful being. It's not two different beings that are acting in tandem or whatever. It's one. I am the same one. I'm the same entity. Okay, next comes the second commandment. Begins in verse 3. You shall not recognize any gods of others in my presence, until I should say verse 7. So this is the mitzvah not to worship idols. And it continues verse 4. Once again, you shall not make yourself a carved image nor any likeness of that which is in the heavens above or the earth below or the water beneath the earth. And you shall not prostrate yourself to them to worship them, for I am Hashem, your God, a jealous God. The Ramban says, and that this is telling a little bit the history of idolatry, is that there were three stages to idolatry. And that was that the origins of idolatry were that people recognized God. They knew that God created the world, but they saw there were other spiritual forces that God used through which Hashem led the world. Those are the malachim, the angels. That instead of Hashem directly making things happen in the world, Hashem sent it through intermediaries, through these angels, through these spiritual forces, these angels. And the people worshipped, so people started worshiping these angels as well. And that's reflected by, you shall not recognize the gods of others in the presence. It calls them, the Hebrew is Elohim Acherim, which the Ramban usually understands Elohim to be referring to angels. When it's as idolatry, it's referring to worshiping angels. And then when it continues in verse 4, you shall not make for yourself carved images, nor any likeness of that which is in the heavens. So that the Ramban understands the next stage was after worshiping these purely spiritual forces, these angels, they started worshiping the more physical things that Hashem used in as his messengers in sending what Hashem sends to the world. And these are the constellations, the zodiacs, the sun, the moon, the stars, which many people worship. The Egyptians worship the sun god, and people worship the moon god and the stars gods, and the zodiac signs. And that's the nor any likeness of that which is in the heavens above, or on the earth below, or in the water beneath the earth. That's referring to the third stage of idolatry, that people worship demons and other like negative spiritual forces. And those are the earth below or in the water beneath the earth. Okay, then it calls Hashem your God is a jealous God. And the Ramban points out that we only see Hashem being called a jealous God when it talks about the Jews doing idolatry. It doesn't talk about call Hashem a jealous God in reference to any other sin, nor when it talks about non-Jews worshiping idols, only when it talks about Jews doing the sin of idolatry. And it says the reason for that is that jealous here doesn't mean that Hashem is jealous of others, that he wants what they have. Is jealous in the same sense as like a jealous spouse, where when the other spouse starts to stray to, like if a wife leaves her husband for someone else, so the husband feels the word they use is jealousy. It's the recognition of that the person is abandoning them for someone else, and that's what we're doing with that. In a sense, the Torah is the marriage between Hashem and the Jewish people. It's a binding, loving contract between us and Hashem. And when we stray from that to other gods, to the deities that others believe in, so that's like a spouse leaving their spouse for someone else, and it's an act of betrayal. That's the jealousy that's referred to here. And then it says, who visits the sin of fathers upon children to the third and fourth generation for my enemies. The commentaries go in great length about this. What does that mean that they visit the sin of the fathers upon children to the third and fourth generation? Many commentaries say, like, why does Hashem punish the children for the father's sin? Many commentaries say that it means that if the children follow in the path of the father, so then they're punished for their sin and for the fact that they're carrying on the tradition of sin of the family. Whereas the Ramban does not understand it that way. The Ramban understands that this is literal, that there are times that sometimes a person sinned that, this is kind of my own understanding of it. But the Ramban understands that there are times that a person messes up, and a parent can mess up to the point that their own efforts aren't enough to fix that. And their children need to as well. And just a little bit of a mashal is that when we understand when, let's say, a mother, while she's expecting a child, if she acts in an unhealthy way, let's say she smokes and she drinks and she does drugs, we understand that that's damaging to the child. And if the child has birth defects, and if the child is unhealthy, we understand that that's natural, that a parent's actions affect the child. And especially before they're born, but even after they're born, what a parent sees from the child, that affects the child positively or negatively. But we don't question that. Why does the child deserve it? Because we see we understand the physical world. Whereas in the spiritual world too, what a parent does can affect a child positively or negatively. And my understanding is that when everybody in this world is put in here for a purpose. Rabbi Slater spoke about that yesterday, that we all have a purpose here, and our purpose, we don't necessarily know it so easily, but our purpose is to improve the world with the tools that Hashem gave us. And Hashem puts us in this perfect situation to do that. The perfect situation to improve the world with the tools that we need and the environment around us to do our part in perfecting the world. And when a parent sins, so it could be, not always, it could be that the damage that the parent does affects the job that the child has. Meaning now the child is, in a sense, a branch of the parent, is the parent, if you look at us like a tree, that each child is a branch of the parent's tree. And the child's job might be to improve the world in a way that fixes the damage that the parent did through their sins. And that they might be put in a situation that's very difficult to improve it, because that's their kind of the branch of the tree they're on, that how they need to fix the world. It's a very difficult verse though, that the commentaries really struggle with, and all go in different directions. But the Ramban says, but this is limited, as it said, to the third and fourth generation. It's limited to the fourth generation, never past there. And the sin of the father is never visited past the fourth generation, but in verse 6, but it shows kindness for thousands of generations to those who love me and observe my commandments. The mitzvahs, the good deeds that our ancestors do, we reap the benefits of that for thousands of generations. Next is the third commandment, verse 7, you shall not take the name of Hashem your God in vain, for Hashem will not absolve anyone who takes his name in vain. Notice it doesn't say you shall not take the name of Hashem your God falsely. It says, you shall not take the name of Hashem in vain. And in fact, our sages understand this to mean to swear an oath to something that's obvious, that's just completely obvious one way or another, meaning that it may be obviously true or obviously false. For example, for someone to swear an oath in the name of God that the sky is blue or the grass is green, that even though that's technically true, that's still an oath taking the name of God in vain. And our sages speak very negatively about people who swear, who take oaths in general. And this is something that really disturbs me, that you do hear, you hear people saying like, I swear to God about this, or swear to God about that. That may be a violation of one of the 10 commandments. And people don't think about it, but swearing to God is taking the name of Hashem your God in vain, especially if it's about trivial matters, as they explain here. Okay, now on page 411, the next of the commandments, the fourth of the commandments, is remember the Shabbos day to sanctify it. 6 days you shall work and accomplish all your work, but on the seventh day is Shabbos to Hashem your God, you shall not do any work. You, your son, your daughter, your slave, your maidservant, your animal, and your convert within your gates. Even there's a mitzvah even for us not to allow our animals to work on Shabbos, to the point that we may not even be, if someone were to, let's say they have a working animal, someone, let's say, has an ox that they'd use to plow, or a horse, that an ox is a better example, that they'd use to plow the field. There's a discussion in the Gemara if they're allowed to even rent it to a non-Jew, because the non-Jew may use it to work on Shabbos. And if the animal belongs to the Jew and is doing work on Shabbos, that's prohibited. So, and to be clear, this applies to animals, not to your vessels. So renting, let's say if someone has a car rental agency, and they could rent a car to a non-Jew, even though the non-Jew is going to drive it on Shabbos, because there's no prohibition against someone's possessions working on Shabbos, doing work on Shabbos, but it is a prohibition to allow your animals to do prohibited work on Shabbos. Okay, and this is introduced though in verse 8, remember the Shabbos day to sanctify it. How do we remember the Shabbos day to sanctify it? Our sages say this is the mitzvah of making kiddush. Our sages say that we should proclaim its sanctity over wine, and that's the mitzvah of kiddush, which we do as Shabbos enters Friday night, and we also do it as Shabbos leaves, and that's the mitzvah of Havdalah. That when we make Havdalah, we're proclaiming the sanctity of Shabbos so we really proclaim the sanctity of Shabbos on both boundaries, both borders of Shabbos, when it enters and when it leaves. Then the next commandment is verse 12, honor your father and mother, the fifth commandment, so that your days will be lengthened upon the land that Hashem your God gives you. Commandment number 6 is you shall not kill. Commandment number 7, you shall not commit adultery. Commandment number 8, you shall not steal. And our sages actually interpret that to mean specifically to kidnapping. That means stealing another person and selling them as a slave. And next, I don't remember what I'm up to, but I think 9 is you shall not bear false witness against your fellow. This is, testifying falsely in court. And then the 10th of the commandments is verse 14, you shall not covet your fellow's house, you shall not covet your fellow's wife, his manservant, his maidservant, his ox, his donkey, nor anything that belongs to his fellow. So Rabbi Slater spoke about this at length yesterday, and he explained, what does this mean, you shall not covet your fellow? How do you control an emotion? How does the Torah tell us you can't feel envy, you can't covet something? And Rabbi Slatus went with an approach that the first job is to recognize that everything that we have is given to us by Hashem because we're supposed to have it. And if we don't have something, if Hashem doesn't give us something, it's because it would not be beneficial for us to have it, and just the opposite, it would be damaging for us to have it. So if a person lives life with that approach and really takes that approach, so they would not covet what someone else has. The Beis Halevi, though, gives another approach, and that is that ultimately we're supposed to love Hashem, but we're also supposed to fear Hashem. That means that we're supposed to have have fear of doing sin, meaning it should disturb us if we sin. And he gives a mashal to this, that if a person, let's say, sees something that someone has and they really like it. They see someone driving by in like a really cool car, And they really covet that car. They really wish, like, I wish I had that car. And as they're watching, they trip and they start falling. So at that moment when they're falling, they feel the fear of getting hurt. They stop thinking about that car that they really like. They think about, I gotta catch myself. And if a person had that same fear of sin, if they really felt that how sin was damaging to them, so when they felt themselves, this coveting coming on, that they desired something that belonged to someone else, it would disturb them that this is a sin, and that fear itself would stop the coveting. And just as an aside, the Rambam Maimonides says, and I think we go with this halachically, that one technically, that's the spirit of the law, but one technically would not violate the prohibition against coveting someone else's house or things along those lines, unless someone takes steps to actually acquire it. And the case he gives is that if somebody pressures someone to sell something they don't want to sell. So let's say someone has something you really want, and you go to them, you approach them and ask if you can buy it, which is fine. If they have something you would like, you ask them to buy it, that's fine. But if they refuse and you keep on pushing them, and you start offering, even you start pressuring them, you call them, you knock on their door, you send them letters, and even if you raise the price and pay them a substantial sum, but you keep on pressuring them until they give in, that's the Rambam Maimonides says in Koden and Shulchan Aruch, that's a violation of this prohibition against coveting. Okay, and then the Parsha concludes in verse 19, page 413, verse 19, Hashem said to Moshe, so shall you say to the children of Israel, you have seen that I have spoken to you from heaven. You shall not make images of what is with me. The gods of silver and the gods of gold shall you not make for yourself. So the Gemara, and I believe the Gemara of Avodah Zarah, the Talmud in Tractate of Avodah Zarah says that the images of what is with me is referring to the angels. You should not make images of angels, meaning the ones that Hashem uses as messengers to affect the world. And then it continues, gods of silver and gods of gold shall you not make for yourself. The Gemara, the Talmud in Sanhedrin says that the word gods here, Elohim, could also be Elohei, could also refer to judges. And in some places in the Torah, it actually calls judges Elohim. And in this case, the Talmud says that this could be understood that you shall not make judges of silver and judges of gold, meaning you shall not appoint judges based on the wealth or based on money they decide to donate towards the person who's appointing them. Rather, you should appoint judges based on wisdom. And once again, and the Gemara says that if you appoint someone based on that this person should be a judge because he donated such and such amount of money to the leader's wallet, so that's in a sense a judge of gold, a judge of silver, that they're judges because of their money. Okay, and it concludes on page 415, verse 21, an altar of earth shall you make for me, and you shall slaughter near it your elevation offerings, your peace offerings, your flock and your herd. Wherever I permit my name to be mentioned, I shall come to you and bless you. And when you make for me an altar of stones, do not build them hewn, meaning do not build them like chiseled into neat blocks. For you will have raised your sword over it and desecrated it. You shall not ascend my altar on steps, so that your nakedness will not be uncovered upon it. And our sages understand this primarily, that you do not build them hewn, meaning don't use any metal in the construction of the altar. Or I should say any iron in the construction of the altar, because the altar is a place of peace. It's a place where the way that it's expressed in the Talmud is that the altar and our prayer extends lives. It's something that extends lives, and using metal tools stands for a sword, which is something that shortens lives. And it's the contradiction. So we don't use any metal in the construction of the altar. And just as an aside, this is an interesting halacha that I saw. The Gemara says, and the Shulchan Aruch brings down, that one cannot bring a weapon into a shul. And it's for this reason that the Gemara says one cannot bring a weapon into shul, because weapons are something that extend lives, and that prayer is something that extends our lives, and weapons are things that shorten lives. And I saw some responses to some of the rabbis in Israel. I went to shul in Israel. It was in, I spent a Shabbos in a settlement called, what was it called? Sagot, which is right on top of Ramallah. It's the settlement is, it's on top of a hill, and the bottom of the hill, which is about, 50 yards maybe, is Ramallah's right there. And the people there, the people in the settlement would come to shul on Shabbos with their rifles, and they would leave them in the aisles while they were davening, because there's a separate issue of holding something, especially if it's heavy while you're davening. It could be distracting. You're worried about, just the weight could be distracting, and especially if you're holding it, you're worried about dropping it. But so I saw a response from Rabbi Tzina Bashaul, who was one of the great Sephardic halachic authorities in Israel. And he said that if you can't leave it safely outside the shul, you could, in fact, bring it in. And he said, and if it's something that's concealed, if it's covered in a way that's completely concealed, so in that case, you could. Once again, I'm not talking about shul policy, but I'm saying halachically, he says there's not an objection to bring a weapon into shul if it is concealed. If it's covered, that doesn't fall under this prohibition. Okay, shkoyach. Everybody have a great Shabbos.